Hello, everyone. Welcome at Studium Generale. We are the platform for knowledge and reflection of the Utrecht University. My name is Laura Mol. I work for Studium Generale, and I'm so happy that you're here today for our series Prikkels, or stimuli, or if you want to call it that. So this is our series about senses and stimuli. We've had previous lectures before. They were about the nose and our sense of smell, and we've talked about pain before. If you have missed those lectures, you can watch them back on our YouTube channel. And we live stream almost all of our events, so also now people are watching at home. I want to say hi to you as well. We appreciate you being here with us live or from behind your computer. If you appreciate us as well, then please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. It will really help us to reach our audience. Know that you can ask questions after the lecture, people here in the audience and also the people online as well via the YouTube chat. So today we have a special guest from Great Britain. Her name is Dr. Jennifer Murphy, and she works at the Royal Holloway University of London. She's a psychologist who completed her PhD at King's College London in 2019. For her PhD, she studied the measuring technology of interoception and the relationship between interoception, health, and higher order cognition. So, interoception is the sense of what's happening inside our bodies. It is one of the fastest moving areas in neuroscience and psychology, so we thought we need to have a lecture about this. Our sensitivity to interoceptive signals can determine our capacity to regulate our emotions and our subsequent susceptibility to mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. Not everyone is aware of this mind-body connection or well attuned to it. For example, there are people who mix up hunger or thirst signals. And we ask ourselves, is there a way to increase our awareness? Can we learn to better interpret and understand what we are feeling? So let's hear a round of applause for our guest today, Dr. Jennifer Murphy.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you all about interoception. I hope by the end of this talk I will have convinced you that awareness of your body may be crucial for your health. But first, I want to think about how our bodies interact with the world. Ooh, if the clicker wants to work, and it does. So, can anyone tell me what the 5 basic senses are? You can shout out. Sight, yeah, that's one of them. Any? Smell? Hearing? Touch? Taste, exactly. These are our 5 basic senses. So we've got hearing, smell, taste, touch, and vision. But what if I told you that your teacher that told you you had 5 basic senses was maybe not telling you the whole story, and in fact, we also have 3 more senses. So we actually have 8 basic senses. Now, you've had a bit of a spoiler, but does anyone have any ideas what the other 3 senses might be? Balance, exactly, your vestibular system. So this is the one when you're going for a yoga class and you're trying not to fall over. This is the one that's kicking in just before you fall over. And what about the other one? We've got 2 more. Any ideas? No? What sense would it be if I was trying to work out where my body was in space? So this would be your proprioception. So this is this sort of awareness of, is my leg here or is my leg here? So this awareness that I have, I don't need my eyes open, I don't need to be looking. I have this sort of awareness of my body in space. Any ideas what the last one is? You've had a bit of a spoiler of this one already. Interoception, exactly. And this is the one that we're going to focus on today. So what is interoception? Interoception is defined as the perception of the internal state of your body, and this includes things like feeling your heart beating, your breathing, or simply knowing when you need to go to the toilet. And although this is a word that people may not have heard of very much, in fact, the term has actually been around since 1905. And we have this fella, Charles Sherrington, to thank for the introduction of this term. So what he did was distinguish between these senses, which he termed exteroception, so awareness of things outside of our body in the environment, proprioception, as we talked about, so this awareness of the positioning of our body in space, and interoception as how we're feeling signals, like knowing when we're hungry or we're thirsty, for example. So although some of these internal signals are perhaps easy to understand, we've got a couple of internal signals that perhaps you may not have expected. So something like the heart is quite obviously internal. Your lungs are inside your body, for example. But there are other signals that are generally considered to be interoceptive, like the skin, even though actually the boundary between interoception and exteroception is a bit fuzzy. It's a bit blurred. And that's something that is debated by a number of different researchers in the field. Some people would argue that we need to be very strict and say that certain signals are internal and certain signals are external. But actually, there isn't really a clear separation, not in terms of physiology and not in terms of psychology either. It's actually very difficult to distinguish between what is and what isn't an internal signal. But I'd like you to have a go at trying to feel for your heartbeat. I'll stop talking in a moment and ask you to close your eyes and try and feel in for your heartbeat. Not cheating, using your hand to feel your pulse, that would be exteroception, but just trying to tap into that sensation of your heart beating. So if you'll join me in closing our eyes, we'll go quiet for a moment and try and tap in. Now, keeping your eyes closed, have a think about in your everyday life. In your everyday life, do you feel like you pay a lot of attention to your heart beating or other signals in your body, or do you not pay much attention at all? So if you open your eyes now, you may be surprised to learn that there's actually a huge amount of individual differences, which means that different people are going to respond in different ways to these questions. Some people find it very easy to tap into these signals and pay lots of attention to them, and other people find it really quite difficult to perceive these internal signals and don't pay much attention to them at all. So what I'd like to do now is find out how you found this. So if you have a phone, what I'd like you to do is to jump on and tell me how you found this. So you can either go to menti.com and enter the code, or you can scan the QR code. Very handy for me if you let me know that you're there. I see lots of hearts on the screen. You've done this before, I see. So I'll just give it a couple of seconds whilst people are scanning, focusing in. How are we doing? Give me a nod if we're doing there. At home, I hope you are also nodding at your computer screen. Super. So, I'd like to know how accurately you felt that you could feel your heartbeat. So you'll see, even from that there's kind of a little bit of a split there. Not many people who are endorsing not feeling their heartbeats at all, but a few people who maybe felt like this was a bit fuzzy. They felt it a little bit of the time, and then other people being very confident. How about the second question, how much attention you pay to these signals in your everyday life? Again, a bit of a split here, but most people sort of straddling this middle point where it's like, well, I pay attention to them when I need to, but not all of the time, in the same way of saying, well, sometimes I can feel my heartbeat and sometimes I can't. So you may have noticed that those two questions were different. So one asking about the amount of attention you pay to internal signals, and one asking about how accurately you believe you can perceive these internal signals. And this distinction between these two things is important. In fact, the amount of attention that you pay to internal signals doesn't seem to map onto your accuracy. So just because you pay a lot of attention to signals doesn't mean that you're actually accurate at perceiving them. And this might make sense, actually, if we think about it. So just because you're paying a lot of attention to, say, the sensation of needing to go to the bathroom, you are maybe about to go on a long drive and you're thinking, do I need to go? Shouldn't I go? Do I go? Well, you may find that if you go to the toilet, in fact, you don't need to. And in this situation, you would have high attention. You'd be very much monitoring this internal signal. But in fact, your accuracy of perceiving this internal signal would be poor. Now, of course, in the lab, what we do is we normally take an objective measure of these internal signals so we can determine whether your beliefs regarding how accurate you are actually maps onto your accuracy. So while self-report is one way that we can measure individual differences in interoception, most of the time we are comparing some form of objective measurement to a person's perception to see if it's accurate or not. And the kind of tests that we use for these different things really depends on what we're measuring. So if we're interested in how well you can perceive signals that come from your heartbeat, for example, we might show you a string of beeps that are in sync with your heartbeat or out of sync with your heartbeat and ask you to determine which ones were in sync and which ones are out of sync. In terms of breathing, we might be looking to see whether you can perceive the difference between sort of respiratory filters where we make your breathing more difficult versus when we make it easier. When it comes to things like stomach, it gets a little bit more invasive. However, some of the newer measures involve things like swallowing a vibrating pill and seeing whether you can perceive kind of the vibrations here. Importantly, though, measuring interoception is actually quite complex. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a fair amount of disagreement in the field in terms of how best we should be measuring these processes. And actually, measuring interoception is really complex because of many other reasons, not only involved with measurement. The first thing that you should bear in mind is just because you're really good at perceiving one signal doesn't mean that you'll be really good at perceiving another. So interoception itself doesn't seem to be a unitary ability. So if you're one of these people who found it quite difficult to perceive your heartbeat, don't worry. That doesn't mean that you won't be good at perceiving other signals, because performance in one area, so being good at perceiving heartbeat signals, doesn't seem to map onto performance perceiving other signals, like respiratory signals. The other thing to bear in mind is just because people say they're really good at this, doesn't mean that they actually are. In fact, we find absolutely no relationship between how well people say they can perceive internal signals and how they actually perform on objective tests. And this difference might be really interesting and might be really useful, because if we think about it, if you think you're really good at perceiving these internal signals, and you're actually not very good, well, you're going to be relying on these internal signals for guiding your behavior when they aren't going to be very useful to you. And equally, if you don't think you're very good at perceiving these signals, and in fact, you are very good at perceiving them, well, you're sort of missing out on an important piece of information that might be useful to you. But why would it be useful? Let's think about why interoception might be useful at all. And I'd like to get your ideas before we go through this in terms of thinking about why would interoception be important for us. So this is a different one to scan, to jump onto this. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a word cloud together, hopefully, if all goes to plan. Okay, I'll give it a couple of seconds for you to jump on. It looks like most of us are here. So, why do you think interoception might be important for us in our everyday lives? Let me know what you think. So I'm going to let this jump around, but we've got a few popping out that seem, I think, health coming out, certainly, both physical health and mental health. This kind of self-understanding, connection to the body, knowing whether you need to act on whether there is anything wrong in the body, for example. Also safety and kind of prevention, so knowing when something's wrong so that you can act. And also things like self-reflection, self-regulation, monitoring the amount of stress you have, all of these things that you've come up with, yeah, I would 100% agree with. So what I'd like to do now is go through some of these implications of individual differences in interoception in a bit more detail. And firstly, I just want to point out that whilst everyone does big up their own research field, and I'm not lying, people are really interested in interoception at the moment. So this graph that you can see here is tracking from 1905, when the term interoception was first introduced, until around 2015, and this is sort of continued on from there. And you can see there's been this massive uptick in interest in interoception since around 2015 onwards. You can see it slightly starts to increase around 1980 or so, where we have this increased focus on measurement of interoception. But in recent years, I would argue that interest in interoception has gradually grown and grown because of the understanding that you've all picked up on that interoception may be really important for our health. Now, at the very most basic level, as you all picked up on, interoception may be important for maintaining things like homeostasis, so balance in our body. It's the state that is going to prompt us to act. When we feel thirsty, it's going to tell us to grab a drink. When we're feeling hot, it's going to prompt us to take off our jumper, for example. And understandably, if we have problems perceiving these internal signals, then we're going to be missing out on important cues for our physical health. And perhaps unsurprisingly then, difficulties perceiving internal signals has been associated with a number of conditions, for example, like obesity and also eating disorders. But really, the contribution of interoception goes beyond mere physical health. And perhaps we can see it being quite obvious that there may be implications to not being able to perceive bodily signals for physical health. But for mental health, perhaps the link is a bit more tricky to understand. Now, in terms of the domains with which interoception have been associated with, there are a number of fundamental cognitive domains that individual differences in interoception seem to be influencing. And this includes things like emotional ability, so people with better interoception seem to be more sensitive to the emotions of other people. Equally, things like social skills, so for example, we find that people who have higher interoception also seem to be better at taking the perspective of another person. So understanding that the contents of your mind might be different from the contents of another person's mind. And also some studies suggesting that interoception may be important for things like learning and also decision-making ability. There's a study that was done a few years back now looking at financial traders' profit and loss in relation to their interoceptive ability. And these studies found that there was this relationship whereby risky decision-making was better in those who had higher interoception. And this might be the basis of phrases you may have heard of, like follow your gut or gut feelings and gut decision-making. But all of these things so far have generally focused on the perception of other people's emotions or social abilities. And so what I want to think about now is how interoception might contribute to our experience of our own emotions. So how do we know if we are happy, sad, disgusted? Any ideas? How do we know that we're even experiencing emotions at all? Yeah? Yeah, so there's usually a change in your body's internal state. So I think most psychologists would agree that when we experience an emotion, there's usually some sort of change in our physiology. So, for example, like our heart racing fast. But the problem is that our heart beating fast, this could mean many things, right? We might feel excited, we might be scared or nervous, or we may have just run for the bus. So most theories of emotions are suggesting that as well as perceiving signals that come from the inside of our body, so noticing a change in our body's internal state, what we're doing is we're almost acting like detectives and trying to piece information from the world around us. So the same internal state might be interpreted in different ways depending on the context. So I'll break this down. Say we've got a racing heartbeat and we're about to go on holiday. Well, we might be labeling this internal state as the emotion of excitement. But equally, if you have a change in your body state and your heart is racing really fast and you're about to give a presentation, or you are giving a presentation, what you may find is you're more likely to label this internal state as feeling a bit anxious or a bit nervous. So whilst we do use other cues as well, for example, from our environment and the context, most theories are suggesting that noticing a change and being able to perceive a change in our body's internal state is really an important part of having an emotional experience. But what about the evidence for this, for these theories? Well, many papers now are showing this sort of clear link between emotional ability and interoceptive ability. So people who report having difficulties perceiving emotions also seem to report having difficulties perceiving interoceptive cues, for example, hunger or tiredness. And we also find that people who report emotional difficulties, so who struggle to perceive their emotions or describe their emotional experience, also seem to rely more on external cues in the environment rather than internal cues when gauging things like their internal states. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, this was an experimental task where we manipulated this, and it was a respiratory task. But one other way of thinking about this, reliance on internal versus external cues, would be something like, if I was trying to work out whether I'm hungry or not, am I relying on internal signals of hunger, or am I relying on external signals like it's the time of day that I usually eat, or how long has it been since I last ate, for example? And what we find is that people who have difficulties with emotions don't seem to be using these internal cues. What they seem to be relying on more is external cues in the environment, perhaps to be compensating for any difficulties that they have with interoception. So, what this has all been leading to, perhaps, is this link that we see between interoception and mental health. And perhaps it's not massively surprising, given that interoception seems to be impacting upon a variety of these fundamental cognitive domains, that in fact we do seem to see this link between interoception and mental health. In fact, there are a number of different conditions, and I'm just putting a few up here, but a number of conditions where differences in interoception have been reported. Now, some of these differences are going to be lower accuracy of perceiving internal signals, and others being more attention to internal signals, as well as things like differences in the interpretation of internal signals. So, there's many different ways that individuals may differ with respect to interoception, and we don't necessarily see the exact same interoceptive profile across a variety of different conditions. But in fact, the fact that we see there are so many conditions that seem to be associated with these difficulties with interoception or differences with respect to interoception has led towards the suggestion that interoception might be a sort of common vulnerability factor across a variety of different conditions. Now, this suggestion has led towards the idea that interoception might go some way towards explaining, in part, why some conditions share so many symptoms in common. So if we think about a number of mental health conditions, things like emotional difficulties, somatic symptoms, so these are physical symptoms, problems with sleep, for example, as well as social difficulties, these general symptoms are not specific to one mental health condition. In fact, they are observed across a variety of different conditions, and interoception has been associated with all of these different sort of symptoms and difficulties. But actually, as I mentioned earlier, there are specific interoceptive profiles across different conditions, meaning that different conditions have unique profiles with respect to interoception. And in that way, these kind of unique profiles might be contributing towards some of the symptoms that are more specific to conditions, things like panic symptoms in anxiety or atypical eating in eating disorders, for example. Now, this is also sort of fitting with evidence that we find from neuroimaging. So this is quite an interesting paper where what they did is they looked across a number of different mental health conditions, and they looked to see whether there was common areas in the brain that seemed to be disrupted or atypical. And what they found was there were two regions that seemed to be common across different mental health conditions, and these were the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. And in fact, those are two areas that are associated with the processing of interoceptive signals. So the insula being really this area that integrates interoceptive signals together, and the anterior cingulate cortex generally considered to be an area that prompts us to act on these internal signals. So grab a drink when we feel thirsty, for example. Now, in terms of how people with different mental health conditions seem to be performing when they're doing these interoceptive tests. Again, this is a study where they pull together lots of different evidence and had a look across it. So they ran a meta-analysis, and what they found was, again, there was common atypicalities in the insula that were associated with a number of different mental health conditions. So common across these conditions when performing these interoceptive tasks was this difference in the activation in the insula. And therefore, again, suggesting that the insula and also interoception being implicated as this kind of common factor. What's also very interesting about this particular paper was they examined the areas that seemed to be targeted by treatments, so for example, medication treatments. And what they found was that this area, the insula, isn't being targeted by medication treatments, and therefore suggesting that treatments that may be targeting interoception could be useful for improving mental health. So we get to the question that I get asked every single time that I do a talk on interoception. How do I improve my interoception? What am I going to do to make this better? And I'm going to give you the answer that I give every time I do this talk, which is to hold on a moment. And this is because we don't really know what the optimal level of interoception might be. It's certainly a situation where potentially you could have too much of a good thing. So it might be useful to pay attention to your internal signals when something's wrong, and hopefully your body is going to be able to perceive and tell you that something's wrong. But this probably isn't something that you want to be monitoring all the time. So if you're paying a lot of attention to what's going on in your body, you're probably going to be missing out on other information. So you kind of want that flexibility in terms of the amount of attention that you're deploying to this internal signal. So because we don't know exactly where is optimal, we don't want to train people to be so good with interoception, which then ends up being maladaptive, in equally being finding this very difficult might be maladaptive. So until we know what the optimal level is, actually seeking to improve interoception may have consequences that we don't want. The other thing is that all of the evidence, at least that I've shown you so far, doesn't suggest that there's a causal relationship between these two things. All we've done so far is show you that there are associations between one thing and another. And just because there's an association between two things doesn't mean that they're causally linked. There could be a kind of third variable driving this relationship we are not aware of. And you may have come across this idea before, but I love this example, which is this genuine correlation between eating ice cream and getting sunburn. Now, when I've had a bad day and I sit down on my sofa with my tub of Ben & Jerry's, I don't think I'm at too much risk of getting sunburn. And this is because, in fact, there isn't really a causal relationship between these two things. No, this relationship is driven by the fact that you eat ice cream on a hot and sunny day, but you're also likely to get sunburn on a hot and sunny day. And so at the moment, we don't really know whether there's a causal relationship between interoception and these factors. And also, we don't know the direction of this relationship, so we don't know what comes first. Emotional difficulties leading to interoceptive difficulties, or interoceptive difficulties leading to emotional difficulties. In fact, just because there is an association doesn't mean that we know the directionality here. And what I mean by directionality is we don't know what is driving this relationship, if in fact there is one. And if we think of something like an eating disorder, for example, this is probably the easiest way to understand what I mean by directionality. So you can maybe say that perhaps difficulties perceiving signals like hunger might lead you towards having a greater liability towards developing an eating disorder, but equally you could plausibly suggest the other route, whereby if you have developed an eating disorder, that in fact then you would be deliberately suppressing these internal signals, and this again might lead towards difficulties with interoception. So this is what's known as potentially a bidirectional relationship. So it may be that both of these are plausible. So I've said so far that all of the evidence I've shown to you has not suggested a causal relationship. But in fact, there is some newer research that has started to come out in the last year or two that does suggest, at least for certain mental health conditions, that there is a relationship between difficulties with interoception and anxiety. So in this clinical trial, what they did is they gave people feedback training. Remember earlier I was saying that in cardiac interoception tasks, what we do is we show you beeps or flashes, for example, that are in or out of sync with your heartbeat, and we look to see whether you're able to tell which one is in sync and which one is out of sync. So what these researchers did is they used this and they gave people feedback. So they told them whether they were right or wrong, and what they found was that with this feedback, people got better over time. As well as this, they gave them psychoeducation. So telling them that it's normal if your heartbeat changes across the course of the day, don't be worried about that, and also challenging kind of negative interpretation of these internal signals. So targeting things like feeling that if your heart is beating fast, that you are having a panic attack, or you're having a heart attack or something like that. So what they did is they gave all of these different things to participants as well as a control group, and what they found is that this training, which involved the psychoeducation and feedback training, seemed to improve interoceptive ability and also improved anxiety symptoms. But the question remains as to how does this work? What is it targeting? Because we know that interoceptive training, this kind of kitchen sink approach with lots of different things happening at the same time, seems to improve anxiety symptoms. And we do know from other evidence that people with higher rates of anxiety are paying more attention to internal signals and are also more likely to interpret these signals negatively or threatening, suggest that they may be threatening. But in fact, we did a big study recently and we found that actually anxious people are not better at perceiving internal signals than people with lower levels of anxiety. And so it's a bit surprising then that training to improve interoceptive ability seemed to improve anxiety symptoms. And so a kind of big outstanding question is, what is the mechanism? How does this training work? And well, I don't think any of us know at the moment. So we know that it does seem to be that if you target aspects of interoception, this seems to be improving at least anxiety symptoms, but we don't exactly know the route by which this works. And you might say, well, it works, why do we care? But we do need to work out the mechanism for leading towards more personalized interventions, and also working out whether certain interventions are going to be useful for some people versus others. So if you have difficulties with accuracy, then yes, accuracy feedback training could be useful. If you pay too much or too little attention, perhaps an intervention targeting attention is going to be more useful. Equally, if you have inflated or underestimate your accuracy or attention, so you have maladaptive beliefs with regards to interoception, that might be something worth targeting too. So because there are so many ways that people may differ with respect to interoception, we kind of need to know exactly what part of training is working and who it's working for, so we can target this at the people that will benefit the most from it. But perhaps you're wondering, and this is a big question that often gets asked, why are some people better than others? Why is it that some people find this very easy and other people find this extremely difficult? And again, this is one where I'm going to have to give a politician answer and say, We simply don't know. There's been a number of studies looking at, say, the genetic basis of interoception, and these tend to find that there isn't a huge amount of a contribution from genetics or the family environment. It seems that individual specific factors are at play. And yes, there are a number of ways that we can try and get a handle on where these differences come from, and a lot of this work is ongoing. So looking at interoception in infants and following infants up through sort of childhood into adolescence and later, to really see how is it that interoception might be developing at the moment. This work has not really been done, and it remains to be seen, as well as looking at group differences in interoception, where there have been things like gender differences as well as cross-cultural differences in interoception having been reported. But whilst we seek as a field, I think, to firstly work out how well we're going to measure interoception and overcome that challenge. Really, I think that the main thing at the moment is for people to understand what interoception is and why it might be important to not only be asking, how are you feeling at any given moment, but also to be considering, what are you feeling? Now, if you're interested in this, there's a number of sort of general audience articles that have been written. These are a couple by me, but there's plenty of other ones out there thinking about individual differences in interoception. And now I'd love to hear from you and answer any questions that you might have. Thanks for listening.